Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom in our continuing discussion of the rise and power of Napoleon Bonaparte. Remember that guy that we talked about in class that was born Napoleone Bonaparte and blah, 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 because he actually spoke Italian when he was really, really young because he was born on that little island of Corsica. Technically, not even French, right? Technically not even French, but he eventually is going to, of course, adopt the ideas and the ideas of the French Revolution and stuff like that after trying to fight for Corsican independence and failing after he graduates military school and But where we left off in class, we were talking about the siege of Toulon, right? We were talking about literally this one city that was down in southern France that it began to trade with the British, right? They began to trade with the British and they were considered a counter-revolutionary city, right? They were a city that was considered a city that might break away and then go off and kind of try and form their own commonwealth or try to go against the ideas of the revolution that were on the rise during the Reign of Terror under the rule of the de facto person that was the leader of France, Maximilian Robespierre, right? Well, actually, interesting little thing about it that did end up happening is Napoleon was observed by Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian Robespierre's brother, at this thing as having transcendent merit and believing in the ideas of the revolution completely and shooting the vile vermin in Toulon after he took over the city, blah, 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 blah. But the big thing about it to remember is that the siege of Toulon is going to result in Napoleon's career growing up, right? It's going to grow up and it's going to move up and it's going to move in a positive direction for him, even though, of course, he had people shot and stuff like that just for actually trading with the British and also going against the revolution. So again, this is one of those instances where it's like Napoleon's an interesting figure, but then he's also kind of a callous, disgusting figure at the same time. Now, also, though, the big thing about it is this is when a lot of that negative British propaganda starting up, right? We looked at this and we talked about how they made fun of him for being short, how they were making fun of the French soldiers for looking barbaric over here, and things like that, and actually just shooting into the crowd of pleading innocent people at the siege of Toulon on the other side. So the thing about it, though, is that you need to remember that he had earned a lot of respect from the Committee of Public Safety. Now, interesting little thing about this, though, is as we know, Committee of Public Safety not going to last for forever, right? The Committee of Public Safety is actually going to begin to die off in 1794, and it officially collapses with the execution of Maximilian Robespierre in July of 1794, right? Now, some of y'all, of course, I know that Olivia in class was just like, oh, hey, blah, 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 blah. Wait, Robespierre is alive again, right? It's more along the lines of we're playing around that timeline again a little bit, right? We went all the way up to Maximilian Robespierre's death in class, then we jumped backwards to talk about Napoleon, and now we're getting right back up to where we left off, right? So in July of 1794, Maximilian Robespierre is going to die, right? He is going to be arrested by the Thermidorian reaction. They're going to have him put on trial for treason. He's going to be executed, right? And as we know, what rose up in his place was this thing known as the Directory, right? The Directory is going to rise up in the place of Maximilian Robespierre, and what's going to end up going down is you've now got a 5-man executive branch that trusts nothing that came before them, including Napoleon himself. Actually, Napoleon was on his way back from a diplomatic mission in Genoa, and when this was all going down, he was arrested after Maximilian Robespierre was put to death because the Directory was like, can we trust you? I don't think we can trust you. What are we supposed to do here? And after 2 weeks of being under arrest, they actually released Napoleon and decided maybe he was just following orders. I guess it was really Maximilian Robespierre was the true bad guy. Well, now what Napoleon needs to do is he decides that he also needs to figure out a way to try and impress the Directory and earn their trust, just like he had done with Maximilian Robespierre when he sieged Toulon. And that event is going to be known as the whiff of grapeshot, or the 13th event. So the thing about it, though, is this event happens in 1795, about 7 or 8 months later, after he's released from incarceration after being arrested by the Directory and Maximilian Robespierre is dead. So the thing that happens, though, is a lot of people refer to this as a whiff of grapeshot. And by a lot of people, I mean one historian in particular refers to this as a whiff of grapeshot because he is downplaying the event itself. Well, what had happened was, in 1795, the Directory was meeting with this group known as the Council of 500. Keep that in the back of your mind, the Council of 500. The Council of 500 was this group that kind of worked as a legislative body under the new Directory and stuff like that because they no longer had a king or anything like that. And so their executive branch was this thing known as the Directory, that 5-man executive branch that ruled above. And then the Council of 500 served as kind of like the new National Assembly. Well, what had happened is that a huge group of sans-culottes members, some of you are like, well, I thought the revolution and Robespierre was dead. Sans-culottes members still exist, right? Those people that show up, the without pants group, the violent, poor, like faction of the revolution, shows up out front of the meeting hall in Paris where the Directory and the Council of 500 actually meet. And in this moment, Sans-Culottes members began throwing rocks and items at the doors and threatening to burn it down, and were freaking out because they wanted to go back to the way things were underneath the Reign of Terror. Well, the Directory, freaking out about this, doesn't really know what to do. So enter in Napoleon, right? And on the 13th of which is actually October of 1795. So actually it was about a year and a half, like a year and a couple months after Robespierre had already died. So the thing about it though is he shows up and he fires on those Sans-Culottes members, right? He shoots into the crowd, and over 100 people died on this day when Napoleon shot cannons into the charging Sans-Culottes members, right? So to disperse them and get them to leave the Directory alone, and to prevent them from actually burning the meeting hall down. Well, the thing about it, though, is a very, very famous moment right here is that he's earning the trust of the Directory as well. They're now being like, oh, he's a guy that we can trust. Let's make him a general in the new army of Italy and stuff like that. So what's going to end up happening is two famous things happen after this moment. The reason why it's called a whiff of grapeshot, quote unquote, is because a whiff is like something minor. Like I'm taking a whiff of something. I'm like, it's a slow, subtle action, right? Well, the historian that liked Napoleon a lot called it a whiff of grapeshot because he was like, oh, it wasn't a big deal. It was just a whiff of grapeshot and shot into a crowd of poor people because he's a piece of crap. Now, anyway, so what grapeshot is, just to give you a heads up, is it looks like this. It's basically like for any of y'all that have ever shot like a shotgun before or anything like that, have ever seen like a shotgun shell, it's basically in a nutshell kind of like that, right? But you load it into a cannon. And so what it is it's actually a cannon fire that's got several cannonballs actually bound up by rope inside of the shell itself. So when you shoot it, it's meant to spread and stuff like that. And it worked as a very good crowd deterrent, but also what Napoleon's going to use it as is a really, really great way to shoot at poor people who are really mad and upset that the revolution is basically not going in the direction that they wanted it to go in. So the thing about it, though, in general, when we're looking at this, let me get back to where I was. There we go. All right, so now what's going to end up happening, though, is because of this moment also, is that you need to understand, I said there was two big things. So there was a whiff grape shot. Oh, and then there's another really famous phrase that actually came from this event as well. And it's a famous phrase called, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, right? Apparently Napoleon said this on that day. There's Napoleon actually standing right there, firing and pointing and firing into the group of people that he's actually like firing at. And what he told his men was the Sans-Culottes members were charging at the cannons and stuff like that. He said, men, do not fire until they are closer. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, is where that very famous quote came from as well. So now he's earned the respect of the Directory, okay? And what he's going to be given is command of this thing called the Army of Italy, all right? Now, some of y'all are going to get confused by this. You're going to be like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, I thought he was French. The Army of Italy just means the battalion that is going to go and invade northern Italy, okay? It doesn't mean like it's the Army of Italy in the way that you think, because Italy wasn't even a country at this point yet, right? So the idea was, the director was like, look, we are fighting major battles against coalition forces in northern Italy, right? Particularly the Austrian Habsburg military. And they're not the best trained people on the planet, so let's send Napoleon, this guy who's really, really good at this, over to the area of northern Italy, through Nice in southern France, and let's get him to go over there and take over and win a bunch of battles. And he does that. He does exactly that. He earns huge victories in northern Italy and takes over pretty much most of northern Italy, including Milan, including did he get Venice? I don't think he got Venice. Lombardy, Sardinia, and then also in the areas of northwestern Italy going towards Florence and Tuscany. And when he did this, he actually also looted over $57 million in money and art and goods, all right? So, and here's another piece of propaganda demonstrating the barbaric French armies under the command of the little general with his giant boots and stuff like that, and his oversized clothes because he's such a tiny guy, made by the British, right? Of course, this is actually made by a British newspaper, and they are making fun of him, and the Pope is just grief-stricken up here in the top left-hand or right-hand corner, watching Napoleon take priceless art, take priceless goods, and take other items and loot northern Italy and bring these items back to France for basically like profit, right? So now the big thing about it is what is this earning Napoleon? Even more of a bigger reputation, even larger of a reputation and stuff like that. Because in France, they're viewing him as the best general that's come around since the beginning of the revolution, due to the fact that he is winning major battles and bringing money back to Paris. Now, the other people, on the other hand, the coalition forces, including the British, the Austrians, the Prussians, and all these guys, are viewing this guy as somebody that is going to be a very difficult person to beat in battle, right? He is beginning to win a lot of battles that he has no business actually winning, and he's still just winning regardless, right? And so what's going to end up happening after the fact is that the Directory is going to then ask him, well, what do you want to do next? Take command of the entire French military and be the general we want you to be, right? Be the stud general we want you to be. Go out and win some other battles. Who do you want to invade? What do you think we should do? And he decides that his new motivation is he's sick and tired of these British, right? He's sick and tired of the British and their control of the Mediterranean Sea and their ability to dictate trade and also dictate military movements and practice throughout that entire body of water. Now, Napoleon also doesn't like the fact that the British have been talking absolute crap about him this entire time, so he hates them, right? He doesn't like the political campaign against him. He doesn't like any of that stuff, and he also knows that if you can knock the British out, you can defeat the rest of the coalition forces, because the British are going to be the hardest country to beat in battle in all of Europe. And he's not wrong. The British don't lose at this point. The only people they lose to is like the Americans and stuff like that in a revolution, but a lot of that has to do with guerrilla warfare tactics and a lot of other things as well, which will come up again a little bit later. We'll discuss guerrilla warfare a little bit later. But his plan is he wants to destroy Britain. So the big thing about it is if you want to destroy Britain, where should you invade? And a lot of you are like, oh, just invade Britain, go straight to the island. Don't do that, all right? So like even Napoleon knows at this point in time, his navy is not big enough to try and invade Britain directly. So while back in France, the navy is building up and they're trying to make more boats and trying to rival the British naval fleet and stuff like that, he decides he needs to go and invade one of their biggest cash cows, right? Somebody's like, oh, should they invade India? No, you don't want to invade India because there's a lot of coalition boats out there. There's literally like different trade organizations and a lot of other people that you would have to fight out in India. So the idea that he comes up with is let's invade Egypt, right? So wait a minute, Egypt? Why Egypt? Well, let's look really, really quickly or think about this for like 2 seconds, okay? Well, I'm going to pull up a map real quick. Well, we're going to do a Mediterranean map. Mediterranean map, the maps. Blank. All right, so now look. So real quick, when we are looking at the map of the Mediterranean, right, okay? The idea here that Napoleon comes up with is he wants to invade Egypt for a very specific reason, okay? So the reason being, actually, is because Egypt is the halfway point between Britain and India, right? So the idea is going to be like that the British have to do this. Every time they want to get to Britain, they cut down through here, they go through the Strait of Gibraltar, they go up and through the Mediterranean, and what they end up doing is they dock right here in Egypt, a colony they control, they transfer everything over to the Suez and the Red Sea, and they cut the entire trip in half. So they don't have to go all the way around Africa, which can be a very, very treacherous route. So Napoleon's idea is, oh, let's land over here in Turkey and take out all of their forces and then eventually take over Egypt, forcing them to have to go all the way around Africa, destroying their trade route and destroying their wallet, right? Because the biggest thing about it is he's like, let's make the British poor. Let's make their biggest item, their India, their crown jewel colony, as they called it at the time. Let's take it away from them by taking their thoroughfare area away as well, right? Now, this is a very, very ingenious idea due to the fact that Napoleon is coming up with a way to economically attack Britain rather than necessarily trying to attack them in a way that is a straight-up military fight one-on-one, right? So the idea, though, is pretty good, right? Go and invade Egypt and do this directly, knock out their money, knock out their funds, and prevent them from having the ability to raise the military the way that they want to. The thing about it, though, in the long run, is when you look at this invasion in its entirety, it is considered a massive failure, all right? Reason being is because, one, the British army is absolutely ginormous. It's very, very big. It's very, very scary. It includes conscripts and people from other colonies that they have taken over because their colonies are growing larger and larger and larger. They have the huge ships of the line and stuff like that. They're not going to be an easy army to beat. The thing about it, though, is what's happening as well is like it's an interesting little trend. Napoleon won all the battles against the British on the land, right? On the land, okay? So they won these big battles like the Battle of Cairo, this other one called the Battle of the Pyramids and stuff like that. Napoleon's forces were able to defeat British and coalition forces at those battles because they were on the land, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is those small victories never overtook they never overtook Egypt, mainly because they lost at the Battle of the Nile, okay? The Battle of the Nile was the last major battle that was considered the massive failure, okay? So yes, did they win a couple of battles? Battle of the Pyramids, Battle of Cairo, and our people back in Paris hearing of Napoleon's victories on land and stuff like that. Yes, they're hearing about them a couple of weeks later and stuff like that because information just doesn't travel quite as fast as it used to back in the day. But the big one that they didn't hear about for quite some time is this one known as the Battle of the Nile, which was a naval engagement, right? It was a naval engagement with the French Navy and the French troop carriers and the French ships of the line against the British military. And they just don't lose, right? And they were being commanded by this guy, a man by the name that you should definitely write down. His name is Admiral Horatio Nelson, okay? Admiral Horatio Nelson was the Admiralty and the Lord of the Seas and stuff like that who ran the British naval fleet, right? And this man that you're looking at right here is the one man that Napoleon could never defeat in battle ever. Every time he went up against him, he lost, right? Every time Napoleon went up against Admiral Horatio Nelson, he lost. And this is super ironic considering the fact that Admiral Horatio Nelson is a wounded individual, right? Literally, he's missing an arm. Like, he actually is missing one arm because it got shot off in battle. Apparently, what happened is a musket ball went into his arm, and it was at such a high spin rate that it shattered the bones inside of his arm, and the only thing they could do is actually amputate it, right? And another thing about him, too, is he can only see out of one eye, right? Like, so Admiral Horatio Nelson can only see out of his left eye because when he was at a battle towards Corsica in the south of Spain, a musket ball hit a bag of sand and shot the sand grains up into his eye, and it scratched his cornea so bad and got an infection that he lost all the sight and vision in one of his eyes, right? Some of you are like, why doesn't he wear an eye patch? Well, the thing about it is because he thought it was unbecoming, he didn't like it, he thought it was ugly and stuff like that. He had to actually prove to the British Navy that he couldn't see out of his eye by covering his one good eye, and they took a candle and passed it in front of his bad eye and stuff like that, and his eye never moved or anything like that and never followed the light anywhere because he couldn't see out of it. And so also, interesting little thing as well is that he almost lost the Battle of the Nile to Napoleon, but he actually didn't do what other soldiers and what other admirals were telling him to do. They were waving him down, being like, pull back, pull back, pull back, and literally he was like, no, and he just attacked Napoleon's forces directly and beat them at the Battle of the Nile, making this campaign in Egypt a failure for Napoleon in the long run. And people were yelling at him. They were like, why didn't you turn back? We were waving at you. And he was like, oh, you must have been on my blind eye side. I didn't see you, right? But everybody knows he purposefully did that, right? And that's where the phrase to turn a blind eye to something comes from, right? If you've ever heard that before, it's from that interaction between Admiral Horatio Nelson and Napoleon at the Battle of the Nile, right? Also, another interesting little fact, too, is one time in a battle, he got almost his entire scalp blown off. But we'll talk more about that in class and stuff like that. But Admiral Horatio Nelson is going to become a figure that really perturbs Napoleon going forward because he just can't beat him, and he represents the British Navy and how unstoppable they are at this point. Now, a lot of things do happen from this campaign in Egypt. For example, the Rosetta Stone is going to be discovered by Napoleon's troops and stuff like that, which is actually the device that we now use to translate modern Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's also a language learning software that they call it now. They call it the Rosetta Stone, because when Napoleon's troops found it, it had the same inscription written in Egyptian, simplified Egyptian, and then Greek at the very, very bottom, so you could learn how to translate ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. So actually, ironically enough, to the historical community, Napoleon's failed invasion of Egypt is one of the best things that could have happened because we can actually read what's on the walls of pyramids and things like that now, right? Well, here's the interesting moment, though, okay? So Napoleon is returning to Paris with his head hung low because he's worried about the fact that everybody's going to be like, man, you lost. And not only did you lose, but when he lost the Battle of the Nile, he abandoned his troops in Egypt, right? He just pieced out and ran out of there, right? Well, this is in 1799 that this is going down, okay? And Napoleon returned, though, weirdly enough, to a hero's welcome. He landed on the ports outside of Marseille and got all his way to Paris, and people were shaking his hand, high-fiving him. People were parading for him in the streets, being like, yeah, Napoleon, you're the man. You beat those people. You beat the British at the Battle of Cairo and the Battle of the Pyramids. He was like, oh my God. They don't know that I abandoned my army and lost the Battle of the Nile yet, because remember, information doesn't travel that fast. Only thing they know is that they think that he's this hero that's defeated coalition forces in Egypt and stuff like that, now abroad and growing the ideas of French nationalism, right? So when he came back, though, everybody was like, you're the guy, man. You're the guy. You're the dude that's going to lead France in a different direction. And so he seizes upon this opportunity, and with the help of two very important individuals, one being the Abbé Sieyès. Remember that guy? Remember the guy that wrote the pamphlet that said, what is the third estate? And he concluded it was everything, right? The Abbé Sieyès, who was a part of the Council of 500, and also this other guy named Charles Talleyrand, who's going to become majorly important later on. Please highlight his name really fast. They come up with an idea, and they're like, Napoleon, if we want to grow this country to be what it can be and keep producing its ideas and keep moving forward, grow its economy, get it out of this economic slump, and move into military glory, we need a military leader. And we believe that you should overthrow the Directory and take power as the new leader of the government, right? And so what he ends up doing is he overthrows the Directory in this thing known as a coup d'etat, and it's the coup d'etat of 1799. Coup d'etat is an important word that you need to know. It's a forced overthrow of a government. So he arrives at the Council of 500 meeting with the entire military at his back, as you can see, with the guns up here behind him and stuff like that, and they're arresting Council of 500 members. And so Napoleon overthrows the Council of 500 and the Directory with the military, becoming the new dictator of France, right? And in this coup d'etat, he establishes himself not as the dictator. Nobody wants to be called the dictator, right? He calls himself the first consul, right? What is he invoking right now? The ideas of ancient Rome, right? Consuls and consulship is going to be a very, very important thing to understand, because consuls, what they were, is they are the people that led the ancient Roman Republic, right? So he is invoking the ideas of the Republic, of ancient Rome, of the ideas that he liked about Alexander the Great, even though Alexander the Great was Greek, but still, in an essence, he is trying to bring back the old heroic ways of growing a country off of a small state into an empire, right? And he declares himself the first consul, right? And he has two assistant consuls that worked primarily as advisors. And what ends up happening is he rewrites a new constitution with himself as the dictator and leader of France, right? It's called Constitution of Year 8, right, is what it was referred to as, or Constitution 8. And he actually allowed the people to vote on it. He gave it over to the people. He said, I will allow all of you to vote on the ideas of this Constitution and my power as your new leader. And it returned itself as a 96% approval rating of this. That means that the people that could vote in France, of the 5 million people that could vote in France, apparently 3 million voted. And they all voted for, like most of them voted in overwhelming fashion for Napoleon to become the new dictator of France. That's why it's referred to as a dictatorship by plebiscite. Plebiscite is a vote, right? Like, so basically he was put into power by the people of France in a vote. Weird little thing though happened, kind of just like the weird little thing that I'm touching my nose right now. It was a rigged election. It was actually a lot of falsified reports and stuff like that. Apparently his brother, Napoleon's brother, like actually flubbed the numbers heavily. It was like, look, 3 million people voted, where only about 1.5 million people voted. So he doubled it and then said that the other 1.5 million people that voted just voted for like him in unanimity. So like the big thing about it though is he kind of rigged an election and then became the leader of France. But what's going to end up happening is as he rose to power, Napoleon's going to reclaim Italian lands across the Alps. He's going to fight some major battles there as well. And it's going to, like, one of the big ones is going to be known as the Battle of Marengo. But we'll talk about that stuff in class when I see y'all then, because we're going to talk about how apparently he thought that he was riding a horse, but he was actually riding a donkey. But we'll talk about that when I see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.